In 1980, a 14-year-old boy vanished from a small Oregon town. No body, no witnesses, no answers. For 45 years, the case went cold until someone found his old school bag, buried beneath a tree. Inside a cassette tape. And what it revealed unraveled everything. This is the haunting story of Daniel Whitmore and the secrets Elder Hollow tried to forge. Please subscribe before watching. The birch tree had stood there for decades, its white bark cracked with time, its roots twisting deep into the soil of Elder Hollow, like fingers refusing to let go. On the edge of the old churchyard, past the broken fence and forgotten gravestones, it rose like a sentinel watching the slow decay of memory. Sheriff Henry Blackwell had always hated this place, now retired and well into his 70s. He stood again beneath that same tree. The call had come in earlier that morning. A groundskeeper clearing overgrowth behind the church had tripped over something buried shallow in the dirt. A soft object fabric, mostly faded blue canvas, a school bag, and stitched into the torn flap and fraying yellow thread were the words that had haunted Henry for 45 years. Daniel Whitmore, Grade 8, Room 3. He hadn't heard that name spoken aloud in years, not since the anniversary vigils had stopped, not since Daniel's mother had passed away in a nursing home 2 towns over, but the name never left his mind. Not really. It just waited quiet and patient, like a wound sealed over but never quite healed. "You okay?" "Sheriff." Deputy Maria Alvarez stood a few paces away, kneeling by the unearthed bag with gloved hands. She'd been 6 when Daniel vanished, too young to remember the search parties, the police roadblocks, the way the entire town had turned inward. Suspicious and scared, Henry didn't answer. His throat was tight. The old scar on his shoulder, the one from the winter he'd broken it, falling on black ice tight in the damp spring air. Alvarez gently opened the bag, dirt spilled from the zipper as she tugged it open. Inside were warped notebooks, half, disintegrated comic books, and a metal thermos with a rusted lid. Everything was soft, with moisture and rot. Everything except one item, carefully wrapped in a plastic bag that had somehow held together a cassette tape. It was labeled in faded pen, October 10th, 1980. Last day. Henry felt his stomach turn. That was the day Daniel went missing. Not a week before, not a day after. That day a Friday, the kind of day where the leaves fall heavier, the wind speaks a little louder, and nothing ever feels quite right again. Alvarez looked up. "Should we call the lab?" "No," Henry said softly. His voice had grown quieter with the years, but it still carried weight when he used it. "Not yet. Let's not scare the town unless there's something to be scared of." "But this might be it, Sheriff," she said, almost whispering. "This might be what we were always missing." He looked at her and nodded. Not because he agreed, but because he knew what hope sounded like in someone who didn't yet know how it could betray you. They brought the bag back to the station. The evidence room smelled the same cold metal dust and the faint acidic bite of old printer ink. Henry sat with the bag at the old wood table in interview room, no handcuffs, no bright light, just the silence of memory settling into its seat. They played the tape using the department's only remaining tape deck. The audio was scratchy at first, filled with ambient static, but then a boy's voice emerged. Young, tentative, the kind of voice that breaks before it deepens. "Hi, it's me." Daniel Henry froze. The voice was unmistakable. Daniel Whitmore, 14 years old, missing since 1980. "I don't know if anyone will ever hear this," the boy said, voice cracking slightly, "but if you're listening, I guess I didn't make it out." Alvarez instinctively covered her mouth. "I thought I could run," Daniel continued. "But he found me again. He always finds me." There was a pause. The sound of wind or water. Hard to tell. Then the voice again. He said, "I should have kept quiet, that I knew too much, but I didn't mean to. Honest, I just saw something I wasn't supposed to." Henry gripped the table. His knuckles went white. "I'm in a dark place," Daniel whispered. "A cellar, I think. I don't know where. It smells like dirt and rust. I can hear footsteps sometimes." and I think he's watching me. Another pause. If I don't get out, I want my mom to know I love her. And to Mr. Blackwell, I'm sorry I ran when you called me. I was scared. I thought maybe if I stayed hidden, he'd forget about me. The tape clicked softly. The end silence filled the room. Henry sat back, exhaling slowly, like someone who had just surfaced after being underwater too long. Well, he said after a long beat, looks like we're not done with 1980 after all. The tape was rewound 3 times before Henry could bring himself to listen to it again. Each time Daniel's voice filled the room, it chipped something loose inside his chest, something Henry had long since thought calcified. Alvarez stood at the edge of the room, arms folded, eyes distant. You knew him pretty well, didn't you? She asked quietly. Henry didn't look up. I coached him in Little League. Silence followed, the kind that doesn't ask for more. They had the tape digitized and submitted to the state lab, but Henry kept a copy on his phone. He didn't know why. Maybe because hearing Daniel's voice reminded him this wasn't just a case. It was a boy, a scared, forgotten boy who hadn't been forgotten by everyone. As dusk fell over Elder Hollow, Henry sat in his old recliner, the lights dim. A single glass of whiskey on the table beside him. The police scanner on his bookshelf still crackled faintly like it had for decades, even though no one called him sheriff anymore. He played the tape again. I thought I could run, but he found me again. There it was. He not, they not. Someone he... Henry wrote the word on a yellow legal pad and circled it 3 times. In 1980, the department had questioned everyone in Daniel's orbit. Teachers, neighbors, classmates, even the Whitmore themselves. Nothing had come of it, but now, they had something. Alvarez, he said the next morning at the station, holding up the bag. Have this processed for prints carefully. There's a chance something survived. She nodded, scribbling notes. What are you thinking? I'm thinking about the carving. He said the initials on the tree, DW, plus MJ. Those weren't there back in '80. You're sure I remember that tree like a scar, he said, walking slowly to the evidence board where a long faded photo of Daniel's smiling face still hung tucked behind a curled corner of a newspaper clipping. Alvarez crossed her arms, so someone came back recently, maybe visited the scene or couldn't stay away. Henry said, pinning a fresh print out of the photo, the one from the bag, to the board. In it, Daniel sat on a low fence, his eyes squinting into the sun, flanked by 2 boys. One of them was clearly Michael Jameson, who had lived on the same street as Daniel back then. The other boy. Henry struggled to remember the name. Tall brown hair, always wore long sleeves. I want to talk to Michael. Henry said finally, he still runs that antique shop on Oak Lane. Alvarez raised an eyebrow. You think he knows something? Henry shrugged into his coat. I think he might know who he is. Oak Lane Antiques was a narrow storefront wedged between a bakery and a bookstore that hadn't opened since Co. The smell of dust and oiled wood filled the space, along with 1,000 forgotten trinkets and furniture that remembered other lifetimes. Michael Jameson looked up from behind the counter, squinting behind a pair of gold-rimmed reading glasses. He was in his late 50s, now grayer, but not unrecognizable. Sheriff Blackwell. He said, his voice a blend of surprise and weariness. I thought you retired. Just Henry now, the old man replied, stepping inside. You have a minute. Michael glanced at the vintage clock on the wall. Sure, I guess. Henry didn't waste time. He pulled the photograph from his coat pocket and placed it on the counter. Michael looked down, his jaw tensed. You remember this, of course. That's me. Daniel and Nate something. Or maybe Evan. Henry nodded. And the carving, DW plus MJ. You know anything about that? Michael hesitated. I've seen it. I didn't do it. Henry studied him, the hands still in tight, the eyes flicking back and forth. Not guilty, but scared. I just want to know what you remember. Henry said, his tone gentle. We found Daniel's bag, the one he had the day he disappeared. Michael looked up sharply. We're by the birch tree. Same spot we searched 45 years ago. Michael's face palled. He sat down slowly on the stool behind the counter. You found the bag, we did, and a tape inside. Daniel recorded something he mentioned. Someone said he kept finding him. Michael's voice was barely audible. Thomas Henry leaned in slightly. Your brother Michael nodded slowly. Yeah, Thomas. Why didn't you say anything back then? Michael looked like a man unraveling. Because by the time I realized what he'd done, it was too late. It had rained overnight. The earth beneath the birch tree was soft again, glistening with morning dew. Henry stood alone this time, gloved hands in his coat pocket, staring up at the carving in the bark. The initials were simple. No flourishes, no attempt at beauty. Just DW, plus MJ scratched with something sharp deep enough to leave a scar. He traced them gently with one fingertip, the cold bark rough against his skin. Michael had admitted to nothing more than memory. He hadn't carved the initials he claimed, but he knew about them. He'd seen them in recent years, maybe even visited the spot. I'd go there. Sometimes Michael had said, eyes flickering like old film. I don't know why. Maybe I thought he'd still be there, or I wanted to be close to the last place I knew he existed. Henry believed him, or wanted to. But the timing was too exact, the carving too deliberate. Not a tribute, a message left. Recently, when someone felt safe again. A car door slammed behind him. Alvarez was arriving, holding 2 coffees in a cardboard tray. Still coming out here every day, she said, offering him one. Henry accepted it silently, eyes never leaving the carving. Do you believe in hauntings? She blinked ghosts. He gave her a half shrug. Not the rattling chains kind. I mean the kind that follow you through time. The kind that look like your own regrets, just wearing someone else's face. Alvarez glanced up at the tree. If ghosts are real, this whole town's one big seance. He smiled faintly. That's not wrong. They stood in silence, drinking coffee as mist drifted through the woods. Henry pulled out his notebook and turned to a fresh page. He jotted a list. Thomas Jameson, deceased, died 1 week after Daniel disappeared. Car crash, single vehicle. Michael Jameson, brother, claimed to know nothing, possibly lying to protect the carving recent, likely within past year, emotional, not decorative. The tape Daniel refers to, he said, he always finds me. He underlined that last sentence. What do we really know about Thomas? Henry asked aloud. Alvarez tilted her head. Just what the reports say. Died young 19 car, flipped off Ridgeway curve, alcohol. Suspected no survivors, parents moved away 2 years later. Michael stayed any disciplinary records from school. Alvarez raised an eyebrow. You think Daniel saw something about Thomas. I think Daniel saw someone he wasn't supposed to see doing something he wasn't supposed to be doing. Alvarez pulled out her phone and started typing. I'll request juvenile records. Might be sealed, but we've got an active investigation now. Henry gave a nod. We need to know if Thomas had a history, fights, threats, anything. What about the cellar Daniel mentioned, she asked. Hard to say, Henry murmured. Cellars aren't common around here. But there were some Utewildings on old farmsteads back in the day. Alvarez finished her coffee and tossed the cup into the back of the cruiser. We should start mapping locations Thomas might have known. Hunting cabins, abandoned homes, anywhere he could have kept someone hidden. Henry didn't respond right away. His eyes were locked on the initials again. I want you to check something else, he said eventually. See if any of Thomas's friends are still local. Anyone he ran with, people who disappeared from town after he died. Even if they were just teenagers. Alvarez narrowed her eyes. You think he wasn't working alone? I don't think anything yet, Henry replied. But if someone helped him, even unknowingly, they may have a long-forgotten piece of the puzzle. That afternoon, Henry returned to his house and opened an old storage box in the back of the hallway closet, one he hadn't touched in years. Inside were manila folders, notes from cold cases, photos clipped with rusted paper clips. He thumbed through them until he found what he needed. Missing person Daniel Whitmore. Case file 1980, 00003. He pulled out the statements, witness interviews, a map of the last known area. And at the bottom, a sheet he'd forgotten existed. A hand-drawn diagram by Daniel's teacher, Miss Love, meant to help investigators visualize Daniel's usual walking route from school to home. Something caught Henry's eye. A small X noted with a quick scribble Daniel sometimes took shortcut through Jameson property wooded path. He stared at it for a long moment. The Jameson family had owned acreage just west of town. The house had burned down years ago, but the land was never redeveloped. He called Alvarez immediately. "Meet me near the old Jameson place." He said, "Bring gloves and a flashlight. We're going digging." The antique store was quiet, again too quiet. A wind chime by the door clinked faintly in the breeze as Henry stepped inside. Ducking slightly under the low beam overhead, dust floated through shafts of sunlight, catching in the cracks of old glass cabinets filled with clocks and long-dead radios. Michael was at the counter polishing a brass telescope that had seen better decades. He looked up inside. "You're not done yet, are you?" "No," Henry said, simply letting the door close behind him. "And neither are you." Michael's hand paused mid-polish. "I already told you what I knew." Henry reached into his coat and placed a folded map on the counter. He flattened it out with calloused fingers, tapping a single spot. "Do you remember this?" Michael leaned in. "That's the path Daniel used to take," he said slowly. "Back through our woods. I told him not to. My dad hated kids cutting across the property. And this," Henry pointed to another mark. A small box with a faded label "Root Cellar" scrolled beside it in the teacher's handwriting. Michael blinked, then frowned. "I forgot about that." "You forgot there was a root cellar in the woods behind your house?" "No, He looked away. "I guess I blocked it out. It collapsed after the fire. We never went near it again." Henry folded the map slowly. Daniel said he was in a dark place. Dirt rust, footsteps above him. Michael's shoulders stiffened. "I think Thomas took him there." Henry said, "And I think you knew." Michael shook his head quickly. "Number, I didn't know that's where he was." "But you knew something," Henry said quietly. "Even back then, something wasn't right." Michael's silence was a crack in the floor of a frozen lake. Finally, he whispered, "Yes." Henry waited. "I saw him one day. Daniel not at school in the woods near the old shed. He looked scared, like he didn't want to be seen. I called out to him, but he ran. And you didn't tell anyone." I don't know what I thought," Michael said. Eyes brimming now. "I thought maybe he'd just run away, that he'd gone off on his own. Kids did that sometimes. Did you ever ask?" Thomas Henry's voice was low. Michael nodded. "He said he hadn't seen him. Said he probably took off to Portland." I believed him. "You wanted to believe him," Henry corrected. Michael nodded again, this time slower eyes unfocused, drifting somewhere far away. "You're not guilty of the crime," Henry said, "but you've carried the weight of silence." Michael slumped into the stool behind the counter. "I thought it would go away. That time would wash it out of me." Henry stepped closer. "But it doesn't, does it?" Michael swallowed hard. Every time I heard a missing persons report, every time someone said Daniel's name, I thought about telling, but I didn't know enough. I was scared. Of Thomas. Michael shook his head, of what it would mean if I was too late. They sat in silence, the store, ticking with ancient clocks. "I need to know something else." Henry said, "Did you carve those initials into the tree?" Michael hesitated. Then, "Yes." Henry didn't move. "I went back there a year ago," Michael said. "I brought the bag. I thought maybe if I left something behind, someone would find it. And I carved it, because he was my friend, because I couldn't carry it anymore." Henry's eyes narrowed. "You brought the bag," Michael nodded. "It had been in my attic since the week he vanished." "You kept it. I found it in Thomas's room," Michael said, voice cracking hidden behind a loose panel. "I opened it and saw Daniel's things. I knew then, but by then, Thomas was dead, and I didn't know what to do." Henry ran a hand through his thinning hair. "Why now?" Michael looked up, tears sliding silently down his face. "Because I couldn't breathe anymore, Henry. Because it's been 45 years, and I still see him in my dreams. And because I heard the tape, I heard his voice, and I knew it was time." Henry stepped back. For the first time in decades, the fog around Daniel's disappearance was beginning to thin. "There's something else," Michael said quietly. There was a drawing in the bag. A drawing. Michael reached into the drawer beneath the counter and pulled out a sheet of folded paper. Henry opened it slowly. It was a sketch, crude, childlike, done in pencil. It showed a boy in a square space, maybe a cellar. Above him was another figure, tall and looming, standing on a floor of planks, and in the corner, written in small block letters, he said, "I have to stay." Henry's fingers trembled slightly. "We're going to the property," he said, folding the drawing carefully. "If the root cellar's still there, or what's left of it, we'll find him." Michael wiped his face. "Do you think he ever forgave me?" Henry paused at the door. "I don't think he ever blamed you, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't have spoken." The Jameson property sat in a forgotten corner of Elder Hollow, past where the paved road gave up and turned into a rooted path lined with ferns and deadfall. The house had burned decades ago. Only a scorched foundation remained, but the forest had reclaimed most of the evidence. Henry parked his truck at the edge of what used to be the gravel drive. Alvarez arrived moments later, stepping out of her cruiser with a crowbar, gloves, and a flashlight already in hand. "This place is something else," she muttered, looking at the collapsed roofline peeking out from the underbrush. "It used to be a real home," Henry said quietly, "before the fire, before everything." They walked carefully through the brush, guided by the old map Henry had brought, and Michael's vague memory of where the root cellar had once been. Alvarez knelt and pushed aside moss and brambles. "There's something here," she said. "Smells like mold and rust." Henry knelt beside her. Beneath a layer of leaves, a jagged gap opened into the earth, partially caved in, partially covered by warped boards. Old iron hinges clung to rotted wood. It was like the earth had tried to swallow the place whole and failed. They pried the boards loose, revealing a sloped entryway descending into a space. Dark as a well, Alvarez turned on her flashlight. A narrow stone corridor led downward, maybe 6 feet wide. Mold bloomed on the walls, spiderwebs hung in tatters. But the space, though degraded, was real. And more than that, it matched Daniel's description. "Dirt floor," Alvarez whispered. "Stone walls, rusted doorframe. This is it." Henry's heart thudded. He was here. They stepped inside, slowly, boots crunching on gravel and debris. On the far wall, scratched faintly into the stone, were markings. Henry leaned closer, flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. Tallies, hundreds of them, grouped in fives, dozens of rows, days, maybe months. "Oh God," Alvarez murmured. Henry ran his gloved hand along the markings. He kept count. He turned and scanned the floor. In the corner, half covered in silt, was a rusted metal pail and the shattered remnants of a glass jar near them, something else. He dropped to one knee and gently brushed away the dirt. A button plastic with a blue swirl. It was familiar. Alvarez gasped. "That matches his jacket, the one in the bag." Henry nodded grimly. "This is where he died." They called the forensic team, who arrived within the hour. As they began clearing the cellar with delicate precision, a crime scene technician approached with a grim face. "We found partial remains," he said. "'Tis some bone fragments. It'll take time to confirm identity," but Henry said. The technician nodded quietly and returned to his work. Henry stood in the fading light at the edge of the cellar entrance. His silhouette tall and still, the forest around him was silent. Not dead, but reverent, as if it too understood that something long buried was surfacing. At last Alvarez stood beside him. "You think he ever thought someone would come for him?" Henry's jaw tightened, he hoped. A gust of wind blew through the trees, lifting the ferns and brushing against the scarred remnants of the foundation. And for a moment, Henry imagined he could hear something beneath it. A whisper, a breath, or a boy's voice. Finally quiet, October 1980. The wind smelled like wood smoke and damp leaves, the kind of autumn scent that wraps around you like an old coat. Daniel Whitmore, 14, walked his usual shortcut home, cutting across the edge of the Jameson property. He knew he wasn't supposed to. Mr. Jameson had warned all the neighborhood kids years ago, but it shaved 10 minutes off the walk, and the trail through the trees felt like something from an adventure novel. His sneakers crunched across the path, kicking up leaves in little clouds of gold and rust. His backpack thumped against his spine, stuffed with textbooks, a sketch pad, and an old Walkman he'd borrowed from a friend. He whistled softly off-key. Not quite a tune, just something to fill the silence. But the woods weren't empty. A voice called out behind him. Daniel froze. Thomas Jameson emerged from the trees like a shadow, peeling off the bark, taller, older, and always quiet, in a way that made people uneasy. At 19, Thomas still lived at home, floated between odd jobs, and said very little to anyone. Daniel had seen him at the edge of school events, always watching but never smiling. Didn't think anyone still came this way, Thomas said, stepping into the path. Daniel tried to keep his tone light. It's faster. Thomas nodded slowly. You always cut through after school. Daniel shrugged. Sometimes he started walking again, heart ticking faster. Thomas fell in step beside him. I saw you the other day. Thomas said. Daniel didn't answer. You were behind the shed looking through the window. Daniel swallowed. I was just curious. It's abandoned. Thomas stopped walking. You saw what was inside. Daniel paused too. It had been only a glance. A flicker of movement behind the grimy window. A small figure someone tied down, a tarp. He hadn't been sure. I don't know, Daniel said quietly. I thought I saw something, but maybe it was just shadows. Thomas stared at him for a long time, the corner of his mouth twitching like he wanted to smile, but didn't know how. You shouldn't go near there, he said. Okay, Daniel said, taking a step back. You know, Thomas added, voice softer now. Some things are better left alone, especially if you don't really understand them. Daniel nodded quickly. I wasn't going to say anything. Thomas stepped closer, but you thought about it. Daniel's breath caught. The woods seemed too quiet now. The birds had stopped, the air pressed against him like a weight. Thomas reached into his jacket pocket. Daniel turned and ran. Leaves scattered under his feet as he tore down the path. Hard in his throat, lungs burning. He didn't look back, didn't want to see if Thomas was following. He ran until he burst out of the woods and onto the back road that led to his neighborhood. He didn't stop until he was home inside, door locked behind him. That night, he told no one. 3 days later, Daniel walked into school with dark circles under his eyes. His friends noticed, but he shrugged it off. He drew more in-class images of shadows and hidden doors. He kept looking over his shoulder. He stuck to main roads, stayed out of the woods. But that Friday, he took the shortcut again. Nobody knew why. Maybe he wanted to prove he wasn't afraid. Maybe he didn't want Thomas to think he'd won. Or maybe, just maybe, he went to get proof, to find out if what he'd seen was real. Whatever the reason, Daniel Whitmore left school at 3:11 p.m. East Surrey and was never seen again. October 11th, 1980. The day after the rain came hard and sudden that night, the kind of downpour that blurred streetlights and turned gutters into rivers. The town of Elder Hollow, nestled in its usual autumn quiet, was shaken awake by thunder that rattled windows and wind that screamed through the trees. Inside the Jameson house, a 2-story structure with peeling white siding and dark windows, Michael Jameson, 13, sat curled on the living room sofa. His parents were asleep upstairs, the storm had knocked out the television, and the power flickered like a pulse, unsure whether to hold or collapse. He tried to focus on the book in his lap, but his mind was elsewhere. Daniel hadn't been at school that day, not in homeroom, not at lunch, not after Michael had waited by the lockers, thinking maybe Daniel had just skipped or was homesick, but the teachers hadn't called his name. During roll, his seat sat empty, silent and out of place. Michael stared out the window, now watching the wind batter the birch trees near the edge of the woods. one bent dangerously close to snapping. Then he saw Thomas, his older brother, drenched, walking back toward the house, his shoulders hunched, his boots caked in mud. In his hands, something a dark, waterlogged bundle. He moved quickly, not toward the front door, but toward the back, toward the old root cellar hidden beneath tangled ivy and an overgrown chicken coop. Michael leaned against the window. His breath fogged the glass. He wiped it away with the sleeve of his sweater and pressed his face closer. He could see Thomas dragging something down the slope, past the collapsed shed. And then a flash of lightning lit the entire yard, in white for a single second, and Michael saw it. A shape, a small form, unmoving, half covered by a tarp in Thomas's arms. Michael gasped and fell back from the window. He scrambled from the couch and ran for the door, heart pounding in his ears, throat dry. But he didn't go outside. He stood in the foyer, trembling hand on the door knob, and did nothing. He stayed there until the thunder rolled back in, until the rain began to fall sideways, until the shape of his brother was gone again, swallowed by the dark. He never opened the door. By morning, the storm had turned the Jameson property into a swamp. The old foundation behind the chicken coop had caved in the sodden ground, collapsing into itself, burying the decayed entrance to the root cellar under layers of silt, mud, and debris. No one knew when the search parties began later that day. They combed the edges of the woods, the school grounds. The Whitmore neighborhood dogs were brought in, but the scent trail ended at the edge of the property. Thomas Jameson told the police he hadn't seen Daniel. He told them he'd been out during the storm, helping a neighbor with their roof. A vague alibi that wasn't questioned too hard. 7 days later, Thomas was dead. October 18th, 1980, Ridgeway Curve. 11:38 p.m. The curve was sharp, unlit, and slick with runoff. Thomas's truck went off the edge of the embankment and crashed into the ravine below. The wreckage was discovered the next morning by a jogger. The cause was ruled accidental. No drugs or alcohol found in his system. No skid marks, no attempt to brake. Some thought it was just bad luck. Others thought he'd fallen asleep. Only Michael ever wondered if it had been intentional, but he never said a word. Not then, not for 45 years. The bell above the antique shop's door jingled softly as Henry stepped inside again. The air still dense with the scent of wood polish and time. Sunlight streamed through the dusty window panes, catching the floating particles in golden shafts. The place hadn't changed except for the man behind the counter. Michael Jameson looked older now than he had a week ago. There was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. A rawness, a tremble beneath the surface, like a cracked dam finally about to give. "I figured you'd come," Michael said. Henry nodded. "Once we found remains in the cellar." Michael exhaled through his nose. "Then it's true." Henry placed a small object on the counter, a button plastic with a blue swirl sealed in an evidence bag. Matched the jacket Daniel was wearing the day he disappeared. Michael didn't touch it. He couldn't. Henry stepped closer. "You said you found the bag in Thomas's room. You left it at the tree to be found, but you never told me everything. Did you?" Michael lowered himself onto the stool behind the counter. "I was afraid," he whispered. "Still am. I need you to say it." "Michael," Henry said. "Say what you saw. Say what you know." There was a long silence, the kind that shifts the air in a room, makes the walls feel closer. Then finally, "I saw Thomas that night. The night of the storm." Henry didn't speak. He was carrying someone. "I watched him through the window. It was raining so hard. And Michael's voice cracked. "I didn't move. I just watched him disappear toward the old root cellar he was dragging." Daniel Henry's jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. "I should have run after him. Should have told someone. But I froze. I was just a kid. And Thomas could be cruel. He never hit me, but he knew how to make you feel smaller than air." "Did you ever confront him?" Michael nodded, tears threatening now. "The next morning I asked him where Daniel was. He just stared at me and said, What makes you think he's not already home? Henry's face darkened, and then he told me to forget what I saw. Said if I loved my family, I'd stay quiet, that no one would believe a scared little brother over him. Michael's voice was low, ashamed, and I did. I stayed quiet for 45 years. Henry leaned against the counter, the weight of decades heavy on his shoulders. Why now? Michael swallowed, because that bag wasn't the only thing I found in his room. There were drawings. One of them showed Daniel in the cellar. Trapped, scared, I kept them hidden. I told myself it was too late, that the truth would destroy what was left of my life. He looked up, eyes red. But that was a lie. The truth doesn't destroy hiding, it does. Henry pulled out his notebook. We'll need your full statement, everything you remember. Every detail, Michael nodded. I'll tell it all I want to. I owe him that much. Henry paused, then asked gently, do you think Thomas meant to kill him? Michael hesitated, then shook his head. Number one, I think he just wanted to scare him, control him. But when Daniel fought back, because of course he would, Thomas didn't know how to stop. Michael looked down at his hands. Daniel had something Thomas never did. Kindness, courage. Thomas hated him for it. Henry stepped back from the counter. This won't be easy. The town's going to hear about it. People will ask why you waited. I'll answer them, Michael said. Whatever they need to hear, I won't hide anymore. Henry studied him for a moment, then extended his hand. Michael hesitated, and then took it. That evening, Henry stood by the birch tree again. The initials were still there. DW plus MJ carved with guilt now, softened by moss and time. He took out a pocket K-knife and leaned toward the bark. Carefully, he etched 3 more letters beneath the old ones, R.I.P. Then he stepped back and whispered to the wind, You're not forgotten, Daniel. Not anymore. The morning mist hung low over the Jameson property, curling between tree trunks like smoke from an unseen fire. The woods were silent but alert, like they knew what was about to happen. A half-dozen vehicles were parked at the edge of the overgrown clearing. Forensic specialists, state investigators, and a coroner's unit had arrived just after dawn. Bright yellow tape cordoned off the depression in the earth where the root cellar had once sat, hidden beneath years of ivy and rot. Henry Blackwell stood beside Detective Donna Kirk, who had been assigned to oversee the recovery now that the case was officially reopened. She was young, meticulous, and carried herself with the weight of someone who'd seen too many dead children and never enough justice. Tell me again how you found it, she said, watching as a forensic tech gently brushed away layers of mud from what appeared to be a femur. Henry explained everything. The bag, the tape, the initials on the tree, Michael's confession, and the drawing as he spoke. Detective Kirk nodded slowly, expression unreadable. It's rare to get something this solid in a cold case, she said when he finished. We might even be able to press charges posthumously just to officially clear the air. Henry sighed. The damage is already done. A shout rose from the pit. Skull fragment here. One of the texts called mandible still intact. Another investigator kneeling by the wall held up a rusted object wrapped in cloth. Looks like a journal. No drawings, water damaged, but salvageable. Henry felt a chill crawl up his spine. He kept drawing down there. The team worked carefully for hours, recovering bones, fragments of clothing, and makeshift bedding composed of an old flannel shirt and pieces of insulation. They found a wooden spool, its string snapped, and a child's woolen doll, handmade. Stuffed with newspaper, they also found scratches in the stone. Deep, desperate gouges in the cellar wall made by fingernails or perhaps a piece of sharp metal. Tally marks, hundreds of them. Michael had been right. Daniel had been alive down here, trapped waiting, and no one came. By late afternoon, the remains were laid out on clean white tarps in the mobile coroner's tent. Detective Kirk joined Henry and Alvarez beneath its canopy, the smell of antiseptic hanging thick in the air. Preliminary match to dental records, the coroner confirmed. We'll get DNA for certainty, but this is your boy Henry. looked at the small collection of bones, a life reduced to fragments. Alvarez crossed herself and turned away. "There's something else," the tech added, holding up a small cassette tape. "We found this wrapped in plastic, stuffed into a crack in the stone wall. Label's worn, but we'll have it cleaned and digitized." Another recording. Henry's throat tightened. "We'll listen when it's ready." That evening, as the forensic teams packed up, Henry drove to the cemetery, not to visit Daniel's empty gravestone, the one carved in grief 20 years ago, but to walk to think. The autumn sun was dipping below the trees, casting everything in orange gold. He wasn't alone. Michael Jameson stood by the edge of the property, looking out over the field. Henry approached slowly. "They found him." Michael nodded. "I heard he kept a doll," Henry said, "and he made tally marks. He fought to stay sane in there." Michael's voice was, "Never forgive myself. I think you've started," Henry said. Michael turned to him, face pale. "Do you think he hated me?" "No," Henry said softly. "I think he was waiting for someone to remember." They stood in silence until the sun disappeared completely and the woods turned cold again. The crematorium was quiet, almost reverent. A low hum filled the chapel as sunlight poured through stained glass and spilled across the pews in soft ribbons of color. Elaine Whitmore sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze locked on the small urn resting atop a velvet cloth. Next to her sat Henry Blackwell, dressed in his best suit, the one he'd worn to retire, and before that to bury his wife. Today it felt heavier than both. Behind them, a modest crowd gathered: townsfolk, retired teachers, a few of Daniel's old classmates, now middle-aged. With graying hair and lined faces, Michael Jameson sat near the back. Alone, head bowed, the minister stood and spoke gently, offering words of release, of closure, of peace. But the real words were written in the silence between sobs, in the faces of those who had carried guilt or grief or both for decades. Elaine stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she placed a small blue button beside the urn, recovered from Daniel's jacket, matched against a photo she still kept in her wallet. "He was kind," she said, her voice cracking. "Too kind. That's what I tell myself, that maybe if he'd been a little harder, a little more suspicious, he'd still be here." She paused, "But then I remember he was the one who brought home stray kittens, the one who helped our neighbor with her groceries every Saturday, the one who stayed behind after class to help clean up, even when it wasn't his mess. That's who Daniel was." She turned and looked toward the crowd, her gaze settling briefly, pointedly on Michael. "And that's who he'll always be." After the service, Elaine, Henry, and Michael stood outside by a table beneath an old oak tree. On it rested a framed photograph of Daniel. Not the school portrait, but a candid one, laughing with messy hair, crouched in a field of dandelions. Elaine turned to Michael. Her expression was unreadable. "I should hate you," she said. Michael didn't answer. "But I don't." She continued, "Because you told the truth eventually, and because you were just a scared boy too." "I'm so sorry," he said, barely louder than the breeze. Elaine gave a slow nod, then gently placed her hand over his. Michael pulled a small envelope from his coat pocket. "There's something I'd like to do if you'll let me." Elaine opened it. Inside was a check, not large, but meaningful, and beneath it, a handwritten note for the memorial garden, where Daniel can be remembered, not for how he died, but for how he lived. Elaine's eyes welled again. But this time, the tears were soft, not shattering. She folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the photo. The town agreed to dedicate a section of the park to Daniel near the woods, where the birch trees grew tall and thin, and the ground smelled of earth and leaves. A plaque was installed in memory of Daniel Whitmore, 1966 to 1980, a kindness that endured, a light that never went out. Henry returned to the site of the cellar one last time. The ground had been reseeded. The opening was sealed. The soil leveled, nature would reclaim it in time. But Henry knew the earth remembered. He knelt at the edge of the clearing and placed something small in the grass. The cassette tape, the second one, the one Daniel had hidden in the wall. Henry had listened to it once, Just once, Daniel's voice had been faint, almost inaudible, but clear enough. If someone finds this, I want them to know I tried. I didn't give up. I hoped even when it hurt. And if someone's listening now, thank you for coming, for remembering me. Henry stood and let the wind take the moment. Then he turned and walked away, knowing that some stories weren't meant to be rewritten, just finally mercifully finished. It started with candles first, a few flickering in glass jars along the edge of the park. Then more lined across the memorial garden that now bore Daniel Whitmore's name. Children lit them, some too young to understand the story behind the boy whose face smiled from the plaque. Then came the flowers, bundled white lies, wild daisies, forget-me-nots, and hand-picked sprigs of lavender. Someone left a drawing in crayon, a boy holding a cat, both smiling beneath a blue sky. And slowly Elder Hollow returned to the place it had spent decades avoiding. They came in silence, in pairs and families. They came with folding chairs and damp tissues and paper lanterns they planned to release into the October night sky. Some hadn't known Daniel at all. Others had sat beside him in homeroom. A few remembered the old search parties, the dogs, the flyers, the way the streets had gone quiet with suspicion. One by one, they gathered around the new garden trees wrapped in soft white ribbon. A gravel path winding to a circle of benches, a wind chime hanging from the tallest birch tree. Ela Whitmore stepped forward, first steady. Despite the tremble in her knees, Henry walked beside her. Michael stood off to the side. Near the edge of the crowd, I didn't expect so many, she whispered. Henry smiled. They've been waiting too. A microphone had been set up, low tech clipped to a small speaker. Elaine stepped to it. When Daniel disappeared, I told myself I'd never stop looking. She said her voice didn't break, it only deepened with sorrow. But over time, the world got loud again. People moved on. I tried to. I couldn't. She looked up at the sea of faces. He was just a boy, my boy. But he was kind. He was good. And someone took that from him. Silence. Some in the crowd looked down, and for many years, I let the weight of that hate carry me. But hate doesn't build gardens. It doesn't light candles. It doesn't bring peace. Memory does love. Does she step back? Applause was quiet like rain. Then someone else stepped forward, a man in his 40s, graying at the temples. I was in Daniel's class. He said I teased him once about his drawings. He didn't get mad. He just gave me a better pencil. I never forgot that. A woman spoke next. He helped me carry my books when I had a broken arm. I didn't even know his name at the time. A teacher followed. He was the only one who stayed after school to clean up paint water during art week. I didn't even ask. The stories piled up, each one a tile in a mosaic that had never been visible until now. Not how he died, how he lived, finally. Michael stepped forward, the crowd shifted. He took the mic in both hands, steadying himself. He looked as thin pale, a shadow of a boy. No one had ever really noticed I was Daniel's friend. He said simply, I failed him. The air thickened. I saw something I didn't understand, and when I began to understand, I got scared. I said nothing. I waited too long. I told myself there was nothing left to say, but I was wrong. He turned slightly, his voice trembling. I want this place to be a space for truth, for memory, not silence. And then quietly he stepped back. The crowd didn't clap. They didn't need to. A few people nodded. One person whispered, thank you. As dusk fell, children handed out paper lanterns. Elaine, Henry, and Michael lit the first flame. Then, one by one, the lanterns lifted into the twilight sky, glowing orange and gold, like fireflies breaking free. They rose over the trees, over the rooftops, over the river bend that wrapped around the town like a protective arm. Henry stood beside the birch tree, watching the last lantern float into the sky. Elaine took his hand. He's everywhere now, she said. Henry nodded, not lost anymore. Behind them, someone had etched new words into the base of the memorial plaque. Not in stone, but in chalk. They wouldn't last, but they didn't need to. He waited, and we came. The wind was gentle that morning, no longer biting or bitter, just cool enough to carry the scent of earth and fallen leaves. Henry Blackwell walked alone along the worn footpath that wound through the woods behind the old church. It had been a year since they found the bag, a year since Daniel's voice crackled out of a forgotten cassette and broke open a silence that had lasted for 45 years. The forest had changed since then. The trail was clearer now, worn by visitors who came to see the birch tree. Someone had placed a simple wooden bench nearby, and occasionally strangers would leave folded notes or flowers beneath the tree's twisted roots. Henry sat on the bench with a slow sigh. The bark in front of him bore two carvings, one old DW, plus MJ faded scarred, etched in secrecy and guilt, and one new RIP DW cut with Henry's own pocket K knife. A small act of reckoning. He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a photograph, the last one ever taken of Daniel candid, slightly blurred, captured by a neighbor at a school field trip. Daniel laughing, wind in his hair, unaware of the lens, unaware of time. Henry looked at it for a long moment, then set it beneath the roots of the tree. "I don't know if I was the sheriff you needed back then," he said softly, "but I tried, and I never stopped thinking about you." The leaves rustled gently overhead, as if answering. He stayed there for a long while, just a man in a tree and the memory of a boy who had waited too long to be found. Then he stood, the wind shifted. He walked slowly back down the trail toward town, toward people, toward life. That evening at the Memorial Garden, Elaine sat beneath the wind chimes, watching the stars blink into view. She'd come to visit Daniel's spot every Friday, always bringing a single white lily. Michael joined her sometimes, Henry often. There was no fanfare anymore, no ceremony, just quiet visits. Gentle, remembering children played nearby. Parents pushed strollers. Life moved forward, not as if nothing had happened, but because something finally had. The truth had been buried now, it lived above ground. Elder Hollow never forgot again. Not the boy, not the silence, not the pain it caused. And beneath the birch tree wrapped in bark and shadow, memory bloomed like moss, quiet green, and